For nearly 3 years, German tank crews had lived inside a myth of invincibility. The story had been written in steel and blood since August 1942, when the Tiger the High first rumbled into combat at Leningrad. Those early Tigers had seemed to violate every fundamental rule of armored warfare that soldiers on both sides understood. The Tiger's 88mm gun could damage many Allied tanks at long range, sometimes even close to 2,000 meters, but real battlefield conditions rarely allowed such long-distance shots, and accuracy became much lower at that range, distances so great that enemy tanks appeared as mere dots on the horizon. Their armor, the Tiger's turret front, was mostly 100mm thick, and only some reinforced areas around the gun reached about 120mm, making them virtually immune to standard Allied tank guns at normal combat ranges. The mathematics were brutally simple and devastatingly effective. The M4 Sherman's 75mm M3 gun could penetrate the Tiger's front armor at roughly 100 to 200 meters. And this was still difficult, but it did not require extremely rare angles as often claimed. But a Tiger's 88mm could punch through a Sherman's frontal armor at 2,000 meters. The German crews didn't need to be mathematical geniuses to understand what that meant. In many battles, the Tiger had a longer effective range, but terrain, artillery, and air power often limited this advantage, so it could not always destroy enemy tanks before being threatened. By late 1944, the Tiger was still a dangerous tank, but its advantage had become smaller because the Allies now had stronger guns and better tank destroyers. A single Tiger could slow an Allied advance in special situations, although this was not something that happened very often. The psychological effect proved as powerful as the mechanical advantage itself. Allied tank crews developed what they called Tiger fever, a kind of panic that made them see Tigers everywhere, reporting far more encounters than actually occurred. Every German tank became a Tiger in their minds, every engagement a brush with an invincible monster. Meanwhile, German heavy tank crews developed an almost mystical belief in their own invulnerability. They painted kill rings on their gun barrels like fighter aces, counting their victories with pride. Veterans of Schwerpanzerabteilung 506 would later describe the feeling of invincibility that came with operating Tigers. Many Tiger crews felt very confident because of their strong armor and powerful gun, although in reality they still faced serious danger from artillery, air attacks, and stronger Allied anti-tank weapons. In German defensive doctrine, the Tiger was only one supporting element, and the main foundation was still the use of anti-tank guns, strong terrain positions, and deep defensive layers. Positions were chosen specifically to exploit the Tiger's long-range advantage. Orders were clear: engage at maximum distance where the technological gap was greatest. Even as Germany retreated across France and into the Low Countries during late 1944, even as fuel shortages and spare parts scarcity plagued every unit, the crews maintained their confidence. They might be outnumbered 10 to 1 or 20 to 1, but they had the better tanks. Quality would triumph over quantity. It always had. What these confident German crews didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that 8,000 kilometers away in the industrial heartland of America, since 1942, American engineers had been working on new tank designs to replace the Sherman and to improve firepower, and this development later led to the M26 Pershing. The journey to the M26 Pershing began with a bitter realization American tank designers had to accept. The M4 Sherman, the backbone of U.S. armored forces, had been designed in 1941 to fight the Panzer IV with its short 75mm gun. When Shermans met Tigers in Italy and Normandy, they were outclassed in armor, firepower, and range. Reports from the front made it clear that something had to change. In late 1942, American ordnance officers began planning for a new tank with a 90mm gun. and in 1943 this work turned into the T-25 and T-26 projects that were meant to stand up to Germany's heavier armor. They intended to build a heavy tank that could stand against anything Germany had. The scale of the project was still extraordinary, and work was spread across several big automotive plants, many subcontractors, and thousands of workers in different states who were already used to building Shermans and other armored vehicle. Fisher Body Division of General Motors, which produced Shermans in Michigan, was ordered to retool for the new tank. These were not small updates, but fundamental changes. New turret casting, new transmission systems, and the integration of a 90mm gun, previously used only in anti-aircraft and tank destroyer roles. The 90mm M3 gun was a major step forward, and it fired a 24-pound armor-piercing shell at over 2,800 feet per second. In U.S. test data, the M82 APC round could penetrate roughly 150 millimeters of armor at about 500 meters, and the HVAP round with its tungsten core could penetrate well over 250 millimeters at that distance. So on paper the gun could seriously threaten Tigers and even the King Tiger if the crew could get a good shot. Security around the new tank was tighter than usual, and many workers simply knew that they were building a heavier type related to the Sherman line. Later accounts suggest that parts were made at several plants, as with other wartime vehicles, but the real secrecy focused on how the first Pershings would be shipped and introduced in combat. When the first Pershings, in January 1945, 20 T-26E3 Pershings were shipped from the United States to Europe under a higher level of secrecy, and the crews who had trained on them at Fort Knox were told to describe the tanks simply as new Shermans. The Atlantic crossing to Antwerp took them through U-boat waters, and the men knew they were escorting a new type of tank that might change future battles, even if only a few would arrive before the war ended. When the shipment reached Antwerp later in January 1945, the Pershings were turned over to 1st U.S. Army and then split between the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions, operating near the Roa River and around Düren. By February 25th, when Pershings reached frontline units, American factories had already built more than 200 tanks, with production accelerating. By the end of 1945, American factories had built about 2,200 Pershing tanks in total, with most coming from Fisher's Grand Blanc plant, and the rest from the Detroit tank arsenal operated by Chrysler. For comparison, Germany built only 1,347 Tiger the Hunt tanks and 492 King Tigers during the entire war. American industry was now capable of producing heavy tanks on a scale Germany could not match. Yet in February 1945, as the first Pershings rolled toward the front hidden among Shermans, German commanders had little sense of how many heavy American tanks were now in production or how quickly the new type might appear. The intelligence failure on the German side was complete and catastrophic. Despite having one of the most effective intelligence services of the early war years, despite signals intercepts and aerial reconnaissance and networks of informants, German intelligence had very little clear information about the new American heavy tank, and the Pershing only appeared on the Western Front in early 1945 in small numbers. German commanders had convinced themselves that Americans had chosen quantity over quality as a permanent strategic doctrine, that the industrial democracy across the Atlantic was inherently incapable of producing technically sophisticated weapons. They couldn't conceive that American industry could pivot to producing heavy tanks while maintaining its massive output of Shermans and aircraft and ships and all the other material of modern war. Most German training materials and recognition charts focused on the many versions of the Sherman and other common Allied tanks, and surviving records do not clearly show that American heavy tank programs like the Pershing were covered in detail. German commanders often assumed that the United States would rely on large numbers of existing tanks rather than introduce a completely new, heavy design. It was exactly the kind of assumption that gets armies killed. The first 20 T-26E3 Pershing tanks arrived in Europe in January 1945 as part of the Zebra mission, and General Bradley gave 10 of them to the 3rd Armored Division and 10 to the 9th Armored Division. The 3rd Armored Division began using its new Pershings in combat around February 25, 1945, mixing one tank into each Sherman company so that the crews could test the design under real battle conditions. They were painted with standard olive drab paint and given normal unit markings to make them blend in, though their longer guns and lower profiles made them distinctive to anyone who knew what to look for. The crews received strict orders: avoid combat unless engaging German heavy tanks. The goal was to keep the secret as long as possible, to maximize the shock when the revelation finally came. On February 26, 1945, near the town of Elsdorf, the first Pershing was knocked out in combat. The T-26E3, which the crew had nicknamed Fireball, was hit by a Tiger I in a close-range ambush. The Tiger's 88mm round struck the Pershing's gun mantlet, killing the gunner and loader instantly. But even this engagement revealed something the Germans failed to grasp. The Pershing was recovered and repaired by March 7th, demonstrating American maintenance and recovery capabilities that Germany could no longer match. The tank that should have been a permanent loss was back in action within days. In the days after Elsdorf, some German tank crews fought American vehicles that they could not easily recognize in the smoke and confusion, and they began to realize that at certain ranges, the Pershing's 90mm gun could pierce their armor more easily than a Sherman's gun could. Later accounts describe long-range hits by Pershings against German tanks, but there is no clear archival record of a specific Panther crew report from 1,800 meters being filed and dismissed at high headquarters. After all, American tanks were supposed to be inferior. Everyone knew that. The training manuals said so. 3 years of combat experience confirmed it. The idea that the Americans had secretly developed a heavy tank capable of threatening Tigers and Panthers seemed too implausible to take seriously. Then came Cologne. Wilhelm Bartelborth commanded a Panther from Panzer Brigade 106, and on the afternoon of March 6, 1945, he felt as confident as any German tank commander could feel in those desperate final months of the war. His crew had positioned their Panther in Cologne Cathedral Square, using rubble from bombed-out buildings to provide partial hull cover. The square's open space gave them clear fields of fire in multiple directions. When American tanks approached, they would see them coming from hundreds of meters away. This was their ground, their advantage, and Bartelborth's crew knew how to use it. At approximately 3:20 in the afternoon, Bartelborth spotted movement near the destroyed Gerion Hotel through his periscope. He called the sighting to his gunner, identifying the target as what appeared to be an unusual Sherman variant with an extended gun. The range was about 300 meters, which was practically point-blank range for a Panther's high-velocity 75mm gun. This should be quick and clean, Bartelborth may have thought. One shot, one kill, like dozens of engagements before. He gave the order to fire. The Panther's gun spoke first, as tactical doctrine demanded. The round crossed the 300 meters in a fraction of a second and struck the approaching American tank's frontal armor with the solid impact that Bartelborth and his crew had heard countless times before. But what happened next was impossible. Instead of penetrating, instead of the expected explosion and fire, the round ricocheted upward in a shower of sparks. Bartelborth had perhaps 3 seconds to process this impossibility before the return shot arrived. On the American side, Staff Sergeant Robert Early was commanding the Pershing his crew had nicknamed Eagle 7. His gunner, Corporal Clarence Smoyer, had already acquired the Panther in his gun sight. The German tank had fired first, but when that round bounced off Eagle 7's frontal armor, Smoyer knew they had the advantage. He centered his crosshairs on the Panther's mantlet and fired a single 90mm round. The projectile punched through the Panther's turret face as if the armor wasn't there. Inside the German tank, The crew had no time to understand what had killed them. Ammunition cooked off almost instantly, and the Panther burst into flames. The entire engagement, from first shot to destruction, lasted less than 15 seconds. Signal Corps cameraman Jim Bates captured the entire sequence on film, and that footage would become some of the most important documentary evidence of the war. The film shows what happened next. Another German tank nearby, accounts differ on whether it was a Tiger or another Panther, attempted to engage Eagle 7. It too was destroyed by the Pershing with a single frontal shot. The total engagement lasted less than 5 minutes, but those 5 minutes demonstrated conclusively that American tanks could now match German armor in the one category that had always belonged to the Wehrmacht: firepower. Karl Hoffmann watched Wilhelm Bartelborth's Panther burning from his own position in the square. Through his damaged periscope, he could see the flames consuming the tank, could imagine what had happened to the crew inside. He had served with Bartelborth, had trained with him, had shared countless meals and conversations during the long retreat from France. Now his friend was dead, killed by a weapon that wasn't supposed to exist. Hoffmann studied the American tank that had done this. The gun signature was wrong, too heavy for a 75mm Sherman. The way it had shrugged off Bartelborth's first shot was wrong. Everything about this engagement violated what he understood about American armor. And in that moment of recognition, Hoffmann made a decision that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. He ordered his crew to withdraw rather than engage an unknown threat. The survivors who made it back to Panzer Brigade 106's command post filed their reports that evening. They described an American tank with what appeared to be a 90mm gun with heavy frontal armor that deflected Panther rounds at 300 meters. If such reports did reach higher headquarters, they would have been only a few messages among many in the confused final months of the war, and German officers already had years of experience fighting Shermans, and usually believed that American tanks were weaker than Tigers and Panthers. This long habit of thinking made it harder for them to imagine that the United States could suddenly field a new heavy tank that was a real threat to their best armor. Within hours, the Cologne engagement triggered something approaching panic in Oberkommando West. In late February and early March 1945, several German units began sending their own reports about a new American heavy tank. These messages were local reactions rather than a single theater-wide directive, but they still showed real uncertainty inside the Panzer forces. Commands were clear: report immediately any encounters with new American heavy tanks, provide detailed descriptions, assess capabilities, forward all information to intelligence headquarters without delay. The responses that came flooding back over the next several days painted a picture of technological surprise that German commanders struggled to accept. Multiple crews reported American tanks with guns in the 90mm class, heavy frontal armor that defeated Panther rounds at combat ranges. Pershings did destroy Panthers and even a Tiger, but all confirmed engagements happened at normal Western Front distances, usually well under 1 kilometer. There is no reliable evidence of Pershings scoring kills at extreme ranges. The pattern was consistent, the details matching across reports from different sectors, different units, different engagements. This wasn't panic or misidentification. This was real. Some German crews at first mistook the Pershing for a new Sherman variant, especially at long distances, but there is no evidence that long gun Sherman was a common or official name, unable or unwilling to conceive of an entirely new American heavy tank design. The misunderstanding would persist for weeks, contributing to tactical errors as German commanders attempted to engage Pershings using anti-Sherman tactics that were worse than useless. Panzerwaffe training schools struggled to respond. They had no information about the new American vehicle to distribute to crews. Recognition charts didn't exist. Tactical manuals assumed American tank guns couldn't penetrate German heavy armor frontally, an assumption that was now demonstrably false. By mid-March 1945, roughly 20 Pershings were operational in the European theatre, with more arriving weekly. 20 tanks among the thousands of Shermans in service seems insignificant, barely worth noticing in the grand scale of military operations. But the small number of Pershings did attract attention and caused local uncertainty, especially in units that had not expected a new American heavy tank. However, their overall psychological impact on the German armoured force was limited by the collapsing situation of 1945. The problem was identification. At long distances or in poor visibility, some German crews could mistake the Pershing for a Sherman, but the two tanks had clearly different shapes. Misidentification happened, but it was not universal or unavoidable. And that uncertainty changed everything. Every engagement became a gamble. Was that approaching tank a Sherman they could destroy easily, or was it a Pershing that could kill them at range? There was no way to know until the shooting started, and by then it might be too late. German forces did not recover Pershing parts at Elsdorf. Most knowledge about the Pershing came from battlefield observation and from American technical documents that became available after the war. The Pershing used a large cast turret, a method the Germans also understood, even though they relied more on welded construction. The design still showed a different American approach to production and crew protection. The Ford GAA V8 engine produced 500 horsepower while maintaining reliability that German engines couldn't achieve even in peacetime, let alone during total war with resources stretched beyond braking. The transmission included advanced features that seemed impossibly complex, yet functioned smoothly in field conditions. The Pershing had a stabilizer, but many crews turned it off because it was hard to use. It offered some help, but it did not allow consistent, accurate fire while moving. The power traverse could rotate the massive turret 360 degrees in 15 seconds. But perhaps most demoralizing were the small details that technical reports included almost as afterthoughts. The Pershing offered better internal layout and ammunition protection than most late-war German tanks, although it was not larger inside than every German design, with better crew ergonomics and comfort features. The ammunition storage included wet stowage systems designed to prevent fires, a safety feature that German tanks desperately needed, but lacked. Even minor touches like padded surfaces and interior lighting showed attention to crew, comfort, and survival that German designs had sacrificed in pursuit of maximum armor and firepower. The reports circulated through panzer training schools and unit headquarters, and with them spread a realization that cut deeper than any tactical defeat. The Americans hadn't just matched German tank design through luck or accident. They had potentially improved upon it in ways German engineers hadn't even considered important. The industrial democracy they had been taught to despise, the mongrel nation of immigrants and factory workers, had achieved technical parity while maintaining production superiority that made Germany's manufacturing capacity look primitive by comparison. The mathematics of production told a story that was perhaps even more demoralizing than the technical specifications. By early 1945, Germany was still turning out several hundred tanks and other armored vehicles each month, but this was far below the peak output of 1943 to 1944, and it could no longer keep up with Allied losses. Fuel shortages, raw material scarcity, Allied bombing of industrial facilities, and the loss of skilled workers to military conscription had reduced German tank production to a fraction of its 1943 peak. Over the entire war, Germany built about 1,350 Tiger I tanks and roughly 490 Tiger II King Tigers, which was a small total compared to Allied tank production. These weren't small numbers by the standards of most nations, but they paled in comparison to what American industry was achieving. While Germany struggled to keep even a reduced output going, American factories had built just over 2,200 M26 tanks by October 1945, and this happened in less than a year of production. Fisher-Body's Grand Blanc plant produced about 1,190 of these Pershings, and the remaining 1,000 or so came mainly from the Detroit Arsenal tank plant. And critically, this production came while American factories simultaneously maintained Sherman production, aircraft production, ship production, and the manufacture of every other weapon and vehicle and piece of equipment that modern industrial warfare demanded. The infrastructure comparison revealed the fundamental disparity. American tank plants covered several million square feet of floor space, and together with other defense factories, they formed an industrial system that Germany could not match. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant alone stretched across more than 100 acres and could turn out thousands of tanks, and companies like Fisher-Body converted whole car plants to tank work in just a few months. German tank crews knew from experience and from captured documents that American industry could replace losses much faster than Germany, and this knowledge was already depressing morale. When they heard that the United States was also fielding a new heavy tank like the Pershing, many soldiers felt that the industrial balance had turned from difficult to hopeless. The mathematical equation of the war had shifted from difficult to impossible. They weren't just facing a technically capable opponent, they were facing an opponent who could replace losses at rates Germany had never matched, even at the height of its power. The psychological impact of this realization spread through the Panzerwaffe like a disease. Tank crews who had maintained their fighting spirit through terrible losses and constant retreat had done so by clinging to one certainty: their tanks were superior. When that certainty died, something essential broke in the spirit of German armored forces. By 1945, more and more German tanks were being abandoned because of minor breakdowns, lack of fuel, or fear of Allied air attack, and crews no longer had the will or the support to keep fighting. In some sectors where new American heavy tanks were reported, German soldiers were even quicker to give up vehicles that could have been repaired because they felt the war was already lost. Defensive positions that should have been held for days collapsed in hours. Crews who had once stood their ground against overwhelming odds now withdrew at first contact with American armor. The material impact of 20 Pershings among thousands of American tanks was minimal, but the psychological impact was paralyzing. German tank commanders couldn't know whether they faced Shermans or Pershings until the engagement began, and that uncertainty proved more effective than any amount of actual Pershing presence. The Battle of Dessau, fought from April 21st to 23rd, 1945, showed how late war fighting had changed. German defenders still had Panthers and at least one heavy tank in the area, and the 3rd Armored Division reported several days of stiff resistance before the town fell. The American attack included Shermans and a single modified Super Pershing, and while German units sometimes chose to pull back rather than fight to the last, they did not simply give up without organized resistance. King Tiger crews knew that their tanks were still very powerful on paper, with thick frontal armor and a long 88mm gun, but by April 1945 they were short of fuel, spare parts, and air cover. Many German tankers feared Allied anti-tank guns, fighter bombers, and tank destroyers as much as any American tank, and the appearance of a few Pershings added one more threat to a battlefield that already felt hopeless. Units that had fought for years on the Eastern Front experienced some of the strongest psychological shocks when they later faced the Western Allies. Schwerpanzerabteilung 505 had destroyed many Soviet tanks, and its crews saw themselves as elite. They remained on the Eastern Front until the end of the war, but similar veteran units that moved west expected to dominate American armor just as they had fought Soviet tanks. In the final weeks of April 1945, German armored units faced collapse under constant air attacks, fuel shortages, and overwhelming Allied numbers. Some crews were cautious when they saw American tanks they could not clearly identify, but there is no strong evidence that confusion between Shermans and Pershings was a main cause of their defeats. In the chaos of 1945, Some German reports mentioned American heavy tanks in places where only Shermans were actually present, which shows how confusing the situation had become. Many German tanks were abandoned or destroyed by their own crews because of breakdowns or lack of fuel. The Panzer Force was coming apart mainly because of material shortages and the overall collapse of Germany's position, with morale problems adding to these physical factors rather than replacing them. In the last months of the war, many German units, including tank crews and infantry, tried to surrender to the Western Allies rather than continue fighting. This was mainly because they knew the war was lost and feared Soviet captivity, not only because of new American tanks like the Pershing. In post-war interrogations and memoirs, many German tank veterans explained their defeat by pointing to Allied air power, artillery, and superior logistics. Some also mentioned the arrival of better-armed American tanks, including the Pershing, as another sign that the enemy's strength was still growing, but they did not usually describe this as the single decisive psychological breaking point. By early 1945, many German tank crews already knew that the war was lost because of Allied air superiority, endless artillery, and the destruction of Germany's supply system. The appearance of American heavy tanks, such as the Pershing, reinforced this feeling in some units, but it did not create it. For most crews, Tigers and Panthers no longer seemed like miracle weapons. They were powerful tools used in a war that could not be won. After the war, some German veterans who later lived in the United States spoke about the overwhelming industrial and economic power of the Allies, rather than about one single tank. For them, American mass production, air power, and the ability to rebuild former enemies were stronger symbols of democratic strength than any specific vehicle like the Pershing. There is a profound irony in the story of the Pershing's impact on German morale. At the very moment when German tank crews were losing faith in their technological superiority, German engineers were working on new tank designs, but most of them stayed on paper and never reached a stage where their real performance could be compared to American tanks. The Panther II program aimed at creating an improved medium tank. The E-50 and E-75 standardized tank projects represented advanced designs incorporating lessons learned from years of combat. These programs existed on paper and in prototype form, and German engineers still explored new ideas, but the country no longer had the resources to turn these designs into real vehicles. But they arrived too late, and in numbers too small to matter. This contrast embodied the fundamental difference between German and American approaches to warfare. Germans sought technical perfection in individual weapons, designing and redesigning to achieve marginal improvements in capability even as production suffered and existing equipment wore out without replacement. Americans sought sufficient quality in massive quantities, accepting that their tanks might not be individually superior as long as they could field 10 or 20 for every one the enemy produced. German resistance became increasingly hopeless because of the overall Allied superiority in manpower, industry, and logistics, rather than because of the Pershing alone. The numbers didn't lie, and even the most dedicated soldiers understood that courage and skill couldn't overcome arithmetic when the gap grew too large. The Pershing itself was not the superweapon that German crews feared. The transmission proved unreliable, leading to mechanical breakdowns that would plague the design even after the war ended. The 90mm gun, while powerful, had a slower rate of fire than the German 88mm. The armor, though well-sloped and effective, was actually thinner in places than the King Tiger's massive plates. But the psychological impact didn't depend on the Pershing being technically superior. It depended on shattering German assumptions about American capabilities. The statistical analysis of Pershing combat effectiveness is problematic anyway, since only about 20 saw actual combat before Germany's surrender. The sample size is too small to make meaningful claims about kill ratios or combat effectiveness. What mattered wasn't how many German tanks the Pershing destroyed. What mattered was how the mere existence of the Pershing affected German morale and tactical decision-making. German crews believed the Americans had achieved tank parity or superiority, and that belief shaped their actions more powerfully than the actual technical capabilities of the tanks they faced. 20 Pershings in combat contributed to breaking the spirit of the Panzerwaffe, not through overwhelming victories or through dominating every engagement, but through the Pershing showed that American tank design was improving, but it did not play a major role in changing German beliefs about technical superiority. Today, surviving M26 Pershings stand in museums around the world as silent testimony to American industrial achievement during World War II. At the Patton Museum of Cavalry and Armor at Fort Knox, Kentucky, a Pershing stands beside a captured King Tiger, and at the Patton Museum of Cavalry and Armor, a Pershing stands beside a captured King Tiger. Museum displays often compare their armor and firepower, but such comparisons do not fully explain the psychological effect the American tank had on its wartime opponents. But that placard, accurate as it may be in describing armor thickness and gun penetration and engine horsepower, cannot capture the psychological revolution that the American tank created, the moment when they realized that the technological advantage they had counted on was gone. The understanding that American industry had achieved what they had been taught was impossible. To some observers, the Pershing later became a symbol of how American industry had reached a level that Germany could no longer match. This interpretation reflects post-war views rather than statements widely recorded from German veterans. The numbers tell their own story, stark and uncompromising. 20 Pershings saw combat, a statistically insignificant number in the context of a global war. Around 310 Pershings were shipped to Europe before VE Day, though only about 200 of them were issued to frontline units and saw any form of combat service, still a small fraction of the thousands of American tanks deployed. But by the end of the war, American industry had produced a little over 2,200 Pershing tanks, depending on how unfinished hulls were counted. Most of these vehicles were completed in 1945. Fisher Body built about 1,739 Pershings, while the Detroit Tank Arsenal produced around 473 more. Many of these vehicles were finished after VE Day and did not take part in the fighting. Germany's total production for the entire war, 1,347 Tiger the rear tanks and 492 King Tigers. The Americans had built the capability to outproduce German heavy tank manufacturing while maintaining simultaneous production of medium tanks, light tanks, tank destroyers, aircraft, ships, trucks, and every other piece of equipment that modern industrial warfare demanded. The mathematics of psychology worked differently than the mathematics of production, but they were just as real and just as devastating. The long gun that German crews saw through their periscopes in those final battles wasn't just a weapon, it was evidence that everything they had been told about American inferiority was a lie, that the war they thought they could still win was already lost, that courage and skill and tactical excellence couldn't overcome an enemy who possessed both technological capability and unlimited industrial capacity. The fundamental lesson of the Pershing's impact extends beyond the technical specifications of guns and armor and engines. It speaks to a truth about warfare that strategists have understood since ancient times, but that each generation seems condemned to relearn. Technological superiority is temporary, but industrial capacity and the ability to innovate endure. German tankers learned this lesson in the hardest possible way, staring down the barrel of an American 90mm gun that proved democratic societies could produce weapons equal to anything authoritarian systems created. The German tank crew involved in the Cologne battle remains uncertain, and many details about the commander are still debated by historians. The moment he realized that the tank approaching through the rubble wasn't a Sherman, that his friend Wilhelm Bartelborth was about to die, that the certainty he had clung to through years of retreat and loss was about to be shattered along with everything else. The title of this story asks a simple question. When did German tankers learn that the American Pershing had a 90mm gun capable of killing their Tigers? The answer is simple. They learned when those guns spoke in combat, when the first rounds punched through armor that was supposed to be invulnerable, when the myth of German superiority died in fire and explosions on battlefields across Western Germany in the final months of the war. But the deeper truth is more complex and more human. They learned not just about a gun or a tank, but about themselves and their enemy, and the nature of the war they were fighting. They learned that the industrial democracy they had been taught to despise was more than capable of matching their best efforts. Germany's industry weakened because of bombing, fuel shortages, and the loss of resources, while the United States kept expanding its production. They learned that the war was lost not in any single battle or campaign, but in the factories of Detroit and the design bureaus of American engineering firms, and the determination of a nation that had been attacked and had decided to fight back with every resource at its command. 20 Pershings in combat. About 310 Pershings were shipped to Europe, but only around 20 reached the battlefield before the war ended. 2,222 produced by October 1945, against 1,347 Tiger wind tanks and 492 King Tigers produced during the entire war. The numbers tell part of the story. But the real story is in the minds of the men who faced those guns, who understood what they meant. Many German soldiers surrendered because their supplies were gone and their positions were hopeless, not because of any single Allied tank. On March 6, 1945, in Cologne Cathedral Square, at approximately 3:47 in the afternoon, Feldwebel Karl Hoffmann looked through his damaged periscope and saw something he didn't recognize. In the minutes that followed, he watched his friend die and realized that everything he believed about German technological superiority was wrong. That moment, repeated in variations across the Western Front, in direct combat and in rumor, and in the fears of men who never actually encountered a Pershing, but knew they existed, contributed to ending the war in Europe. The long gun that German crews saw through their periscopes wasn't just a weapon. It was the end of an era, the death of a myth, and the beginning of understanding that the hunters had become the hunted. When German tankers finally knew that the American Pershing had a 90mm gun capable of killing their Tigers, they knew it because those guns had already spoken. And in that terrible moment of recognition, by early 1945, Germany was already losing the war because of many strategic problems, and the Pershing appeared only in the final months. The Pershing stands today as testament to what free people can accomplish when threatened, to what industrial democracy can produce when challenged, to what American workers in Detroit and Michigan and across 22 states built while German tank crews still believed they were invincible. 20 tanks saw combat and helped break the spirit of the Panzerwaffe. Not through overwhelming numbers, not through tactical brilliance, but through the simple, devastating proof that American engineering had caught up, that the advantage German crews had counted on was gone, and that the end was coming whether they accepted it or not. In the rubble of Cologne Cathedral Square, amid the smoke and fire of burning tanks, that truth became unavoidable. The myth died there, and with it died the last hope of German tank crews that superior technology might still turn the tide of a war that arithmetic and industry and the determination of free peoples had already decided. If you found this story of courage, innovation, and the turning tides of history compelling, please subscribe to our channel for more in-depth historical narratives that bring the past to life. Hit the notification bell so you never miss stories of the men and machines that shaped our world.